The night was cold, and the stars above the alien city burned like frozen fire. Liara walked with her head lowered, her silver hair falling across her face. She had trusted her people, trusted their words when they told her that she was chosen for something greater. They said she was special, that her beauty and bloodline gave her value. She believed them because she had no reason not to, but she was wrong. The truth came like a knife in her chest. Her people had gathered her in the great hall, their faces calm, their voices gentle. They told her to step forward, to be proud, to carry the honor of her family. But when the doors opened, chains waited for her wrists. Cold steel bit into her skin as strange soldiers dragged her away. Liara's scream echoed across the stone walls, but no one moved to help her. Her family did not cry, did not protest. They only lowered their eyes, as if ashamed. That was the moment she knew she had been sold by the very people who should have protected her. Her body trembled as she was pushed into a cage made of black metal. The walls hummed with energy, and every time she touched them, pain rushed through her veins. She pressed her forehead against the bars and tried to understand. Why would they betray her? Why would her own blood offer her to strangers as if she was nothing more than an object? Her heart cracked with every question, but no answer came. Only silence. Days passed, or maybe weeks, she could not tell anymore. Her world became darkness, and orders shouted by cruel voices. The masters treated her like property, giving her no name, no choice, no respect. Food was thrown at her like scraps for an animal. Her hands grew weak, her spirit even weaker. But in the silence of her cage, her mind still whispered one word: freedom. She dreamed of running, of fighting, of breaking these chains. Yet every time the thought came, it was followed by fear. Fear of the pain, fear of failure, fear that she would die forgotten. One night, as the moons rose over the camp, Liara pressed her face against the cold bars. Her eyes burned with tears that refused to fall. In the distance, she saw new slaves being dragged inside. Among them was a figure different from the rest. Taller, broader, with eyes that burned like fire itself. The guards pushed him down, but he did not bow. He stood, even in chains, his back straight, his gaze sharp. A human. Whispers spread among the captives. They had heard of his kind. Strangers from a distant world, fragile compared to the larger races, yet unyielding. Some said humans could survive what would kill others. Some said they carried storms in their hearts. Liara stared at him, her chest tightening. For the first time since her betrayal, she felt something new. Hope. The guards beat the human when he refused to kneel. Blood ran down his face, yet he did not break. Liara pressed her hands against the bars, her heart racing. She remembered how she had fallen silent when her people betrayed her, how she had bowed when the chains first touched her skin. But this human did not bow. This human defied them. Even while chained, Liara could not sleep that night. The image of him, standing tall, replayed in her mind again and again. His fire burned against the darkness of her despair. She did not know his name, nor his story. But she knew one thing. If there was a way out of this nightmare, it would begin with him. She closed her eyes and whispered to herself, "My people betrayed me, but maybe this human will not." And for the first time since her capture, Liara felt the chains around her heart loosen, just a little. The camp was a graveyard of broken voices. Everywhere Liara looked, she saw hollow eyes staring back. The cages were lined in rows, metal glowing faintly with cruel energy. Each captive was reduced to silence, their hopes stolen long before. But Liara was not like them anymore. Something inside her had shifted the moment she saw the human. The guards dragged him through the dust, beating him with rods of fire. Yet his gaze never lowered. Liara watched from her cage, her hands clutching the bars so tight her knuckles turned white. The human did not speak, not a cry, not a word of surrender. His silence was louder than any scream. It was defiance carved into the air. Even in chains, he carried himself like a warrior. At night, The camp fell quiet except for the moans of those too weak to hide their pain. Liara lay curled on the cold floor, her body aching from hunger and exhaustion. But her mind replayed the human's fire. It haunted her, and it saved her. Her people had betrayed her, but this stranger showed her another way. He refused to break, and in his refusal, he offered her something precious: hope. One evening, the guards threw the human into the cage next to hers. His body was bruised, his skin torn, yet his eyes still burned. Liara pressed closer to the bars, whispering softly, "Why do you fight when it only brings you pain?" The human turned his head, his voice rough but steady. "Because chains only hold the body, not the will." His words struck her like a blade cutting through fog. Her chest tightened, because she realized she had let her will slip away the day her people betrayed her. But not him. He was alone, far from his world, and still he would not bow. Days turned into nights, nights into endless cycles. The guards forced them to labor, carrying heavy stones, digging trenches, building walls that were never meant to protect them, but to trap them deeper. Liara stumbled often, her strength fading. Every time she fell, the guards lashed her skin. But sometimes she noticed the human watching. When she thought she could not rise again, she saw him standing firm despite his wounds. And somehow, her legs moved, her body obeyed. His silent presence lifted her more than any spoken comfort could. The other captives whispered about him too. They spoke in low voices when the guards were far. Some called him reckless, some called him doomed. But others began to see him as a spark, a flame that might burn bright enough to challenge the darkness. Liara listened to their whispers, and a quiet thought took root in her mind. What if this human could truly fight back? What if freedom was not a dream, but something waiting just beyond their fear? One night, the storm raged above the camp, lightning splitting the sky. The guards retreated into their towers, leaving the captives alone in the rain. Liara pressed against the bars, shivering as water ran down her face. She saw the human stand in the storm, his head lifted, his chains rattling as thunder roared. It was as if he was daring the universe itself to break him. Her heart pounded as she whispered to herself, "He is not like us, he is not broken." And then, for the first time since her betrayal, she smiled. It was small, fragile, but real, because she knew the chains of despair would not hold forever. Not with him here, not with fire burning in human eyes. The camp was restless when the human arrived. Even though he had been inside the cages for days, his presence still shook the captives like a silent storm. Everyone felt it, even those two broken to lift their heads. It was as if the air itself changed when he walked past. Liara had never seen anyone carry chains the way he did. Not like a prisoner, but like a warrior wearing armor. The guards hated him most. They struck him harder than the others. They starved him longer. They tied his wrists with heavier bindings. And still he did not bow. He studied them with sharp eyes, memorizing every step, every weakness. Liara saw it, the way he counted patrols, the way his gaze lingered on the locked gates. She realized he was not only surviving, he was planning. One day, they forced the captives to haul stone blocks across the yard. The weight was unbearable, breaking weaker backs with each hour. Liara stumbled, her knees hitting the dirt, her breath gone. A guard raised his rod to strike her, but before it landed, the human moved. With chains heavy around his arms, he stepped forward, placing himself between her and the blow. The rod cracked across his shoulders, the sound sharp in the air. But he did not fall. His eyes burned into the guards as if daring him to try again. The guard snarled, hitting him once more, then again. Blood spilled down his back, but he never flinched. Finally, the guard turned away, frustrated. The human helped Liara to her feet with bound hands, his voice low. "Stand. Do not let them see you crawl." Her body trembled, but his words gave her strength to rise. In that moment, she understood. He was more dangerous to the masters than any weapon. The other captives saw it too. Whispers spread like fire in dry grass. The human protects the weak. The human stands even under fire. The human does not break. Each whisper carried a seed of courage, planting itself in hearts that had long gone silent. The masters noticed the change, and their punishments grew harsher. But the harder they struck him, the stronger his defiance seemed to shine. At night, Liara dared to speak through the bars. "Why do you risk yourself for me?" she asked, her voice trembling. The human's eyes flicked toward her, lit faintly by the moon. "Because no one deserved chains," he answered simply. The words echoed inside her like thunder. She wanted to ask more, but silence stretched between them. Yet it was not the silence of despair. It was the silence of understanding. Days later, the guards made a mistake. They thought they had broken him enough to use him for sport. They dragged him into the yard, surrounding him with weapons, laughing as they shoved him. The captives were forced to watch, their eyes empty, their hope nearly gone. But Liara leaned forward, her heart racing. She saw the way the human moved, each step measured, his gaze sharp. The fight began, and though chained, he struck with power and precision. He turned their laughter into silence, their confidence into fear. The guards beat him bloody, yet still he stood. He refused to kneel, even when surrounded. That sight lit something in every captive's soul. Liara's chest ached as she pressed her hands to the bars, whispering to herself, "He is the storm they cannot control." Her people had betrayed her. The chains had crushed her. But this human was different. He was not born here. He had no reason to fight for them. And still he stood tall. Every act of defiance told her one truth. Freedom was possible. Not tomorrow, not someday, but soon. And in the silence of that night, as rain fell softly across the cages, Liara made a vow. If the human fought, she would fight too. Her chains might bind her hands, but they would not bind her spirit any longer. The nights in the camp grew longer, but the silence was no longer empty. Every evening, Liara found her gaze drifting toward the human. He never spoke much, but the fire in his eyes was louder than any words. When he stood, others stood taller. When he resisted, others remembered they had wills of their own. And when he looked at her, Liara felt a strength she thought she had lost forever. The guards noticed this quiet bond, and they tried to crush it. They separated the captives during work, placed her in the farthest line, and gave her double weight to carry. They struck her harder, hoping to break her spirit. But Liara refused to show weakness when she knew his eyes might be watching. She learned from him, not in words but in silence. Every step she took, every wound she endured, was a choice to fight her despair. One night, while the camp slept under storm clouds, she whispered across the bars, "Why do you not fear them?" Her voice barely a breath. The human lifted his head, his face bruised and bloodied. "I fear nothing that can bleed," he said, his tone calm. The words pierced through the darkness of her heart. For the first time, she laughed, though it was soft and broken. And when he saw her laugh, a faint smile curved his lips. It was the first smile she had seen in months. A smile in chains, a spark in the storm. The days became trials of survival. They hauled stone, dug pits, and built walls. The guards barked orders and lashed at every mistake. But Liara noticed how the human turned even suffering into defiance. When the lash struck, he did not cry. When the burden grew heavier, he carried it with steady steps. His silence screamed louder than any rebellion, and others began to hear it. The captives started watching him. They began to straighten their backs when he walked near. They whispered his name in their own tongues, though they did not know it. Some called him the Stormbringer. Others called him Iron Spirit. To Liara, he was something else. He was proof that betrayal could not kill her forever. Because if one human could resist, so could she. One evening, as the red sun set over the jagged walls of the camp, Liara collapsed under the weight of her task. Her legs gave out, and she fell to the ground, dust filling her lungs. A guard raised his rod, ready to strike. But before the blow could fall, the human stepped forward, his chains clanging. He caught the rod with his bound hands, his strength shocking even the guard. The rod cracked, splintering in his grip. The guard froze, and for a heartbeat, the camp went silent. Liara's breath caught in her throat as she stared. He did not speak, but his action spoke louder than any words. He would not allow cruelty without resistance. And in that moment, she understood this was not only survival, this was war. That night, she crawled close to the bars, whispering softly, "Why risk your life for me again?" The human leaned back against the wall, his chest rising and falling. "You are not broken," he replied. "They want you to believe you are, but you are not." Tears filled her eyes, hot and relentless. For months, she had carried only despair. But now she carried something else, belief. From that night on, silence between them became something sacred. They did not need words, because their eyes spoke for them. Her gaze told him she was not afraid anymore. His gaze told her she was not alone. In the stillness of the cages, in the storm of the camp, a bond was forged. Not of chains, not of betrayal, but of fire and defiance. The guards thought they had two prisoners, but what they truly had was the beginning of rebellion. A human with unbroken will, and an alien woman whose spirit was reborn in his flame. Together, in silence, they prepared for something greater than survival. They prepared for freedom. The camp was built on fear. Every scream, every lash, every chain was meant to remind the captives that they were powerless. But fear is fragile, and all it takes is one spark to burn it away. That spark came the night the human acted. The guards had grown careless. They believed their punishments had broken him. They believed chains of steel could bind a spirit of fire. But Cain, the human, had been waiting, watching every shift, every routine, every weakness. His eyes never missed the guard who left his keys hanging loose. He never forgot which walls cracked under pressure. Patience was his weapon, and the moment finally arrived. The captives were forced to labor under a blood-red sky. Liara stumbled carrying heavy stones, her body trembling with exhaustion. A guard struck her across the back, laughing as she fell. The sound echoed in the camp, sharp and cruel. But this time Cain moved. With chains still binding his wrists, he turned on the guard. The crowd gasped as the human grabbed the rod mid-swing. The guard sneered, tightening his grip, but Cain's strength crushed the weapon in two. The broken piece clattered to the ground, silence falling across the yard. For one heartbeat, no one moved, and then Cain struck. His chained fists hammered into the guard's chest, sending him sprawling across the dirt. The camp erupted in chaos, alarms blaring as other guards rushed forward. Liara's eyes widened, her heart racing as she realized. This was no accident. This was the moment he had planned. Cain roared, not with fear, but with defiance. Each swing of his chained arms broke weapons, shattered bones, and sent panic through those who had once held power. The captives pressed against their cages, eyes wide. They had seen beatings, they had seen punishments, but never resistance. For the first time, they saw a prisoner fight back and win. The guards struck with their rods, sparks flying, but Cain used the chains themselves as weapons. He wrapped them around a guard's throat, yanked him down, and dropped him unconscious. Another rushed in, but Cain's kick sent him crashing against the wall. Blood ran from his wounds, but he did not slow. Every strike was a message. I am not broken. Liara felt her chest ache as she pressed against the bars. Her voice shook as she whispered, "He is doing it. He is fighting for all of us." The other captives began to murmur, their voices trembling with awe and disbelief. The fire was spreading, and the guards knew it. Desperate, the overseer shouted orders calling for more soldiers. But Cain had already reached the weak point in the wall. With a furious strike, he drove his chained fists into the cracked stone. Dust and rock fell as the wall trembled. It did not break fully, not yet, but the message was clear. No cage was unbreakable. A guard tried to strike Liara in his rage, but Cain's eyes locked on him. With terrifying speed, he crossed the yard, shielding her with his own body. The blow landed on him instead, drawing blood. Yet Cain did not falter. He turned his head toward Liara, his voice low but strong. "Run when the time comes." Her breath caught, her eyes wide with tears. She wanted to speak, to tell him she would not leave him. But the words stuck in her throat. The guards finally overwhelmed him, swarming with numbers too great. They forced him to his knees, striking until his body sagged. Blood poured down his face, chains heavy around him once more. But as they dragged him back to his cage, every captive knew the truth. He had shown them something they had forgotten. Chains could be broken, guards could bleed, and fear could die. That night, the camp did not sleep. The captives whispered of the human, their voices carrying like wind. They spoke of the guard he threw, the wall he cracked, the fire in his eyes. Liara sat in the darkness, her body aching, but her heart alive with new fire. Her people had betrayed her, but this human had given her something they never could: hope. The first defiance had begun, and nothing would ever be the same. The camp was never the same after that night. The human's defiance had spread like fire through dry grass. Every captive had seen it. Every guard had felt it. The balance of fear was broken, and once fear breaks, it cannot be mended. Cain's body bore the marks of punishment. The overseers had tried to make an example of him. They whipped him, starved him, and chained him tighter than before. But still he stood. His eyes did not dim, his will did not crack. And every day, the captives whispered louder. The human cannot be broken. The human will lead us. Liara felt the shift most of all. When she carried the heavy stones, she no longer stumbled. When a lash struck her, she no longer bowed, because she knew Cain's fire burned for her as well, and she could not let it die. The overseers doubled their cruelty. They dragged the weak into the yard, punishing them before the others. They thought fear would return if enough blood was spilled, but they were wrong, because this time, the captives did not look away. They looked at Cain, and they remembered the wall that cracked beneath his chained fists. They remembered the guard who fell before him, and they began to believe. One stormy night, when the rain poured across the camp and thunder split the sky, the moment came. The guards dragged Cain into the yard once again, forcing him to kneel in chains. They wanted to shatter the spirit of the captives once and for all, but instead the opposite happened. As the guards raised their rods, Liara shouted. Her voice was sharp and desperate, but filled with courage. "Enough!" The guards froze, surprised that one so quiet would dare speak. Her voice trembled, but she shouted again. "No more chains, no more silence." Her words struck the captives like lightning. For the first time they answered, "No more." The guards laughed, striking at her. But before the blow landed, Cain rose to his feet. His chains rattled, his body broken, but his spirit blazing. With a roar, he swung the heavy links, striking the guard down in one strike. The yard erupted. The captives surged against their cages, screaming, pounding at the metal. And in that chaos, Cain's strength became their spark. He tore the keys from a guard's belt, tossing them into the dirt. Liara caught them, her hands trembling as she unlocked her cage. The sound of metal clanging open was like thunder. One by one, the cages opened, the captives rushing free. Their chains clattered to the ground, and their cries rose to the storm. The guards tried to contain them, but they were too few. For every rod raised, 3 captives attacked. For every lash, 10 hands pulled the guards to the ground. It was not a battle of weapons, but of will, and the captives' will was stronger. Fueled by the humans' defiance, they fought with everything left in them. Liara stood beside Cain, her heart racing, her body alive. She picked up a fallen weapon, the cold weight strange in her hands. But she held it firm. Her betrayal no longer chained her spirit. Her fear no longer guided her steps. She struck at the guards with the strength of someone reborn. And Cain's voice rose above the storm. "Fight and be free." The camp became a battlefield. Chains turned into weapons, stones into hammers, even broken cages into shields. The overseers screamed, but their voices were drowned by the roar of rebellion. For the first time, the slaves fought not to survive another day, but to win their freedom. Every strike, every cry, every drop of blood was a step toward it. When the final tower fell, and the overseer lay broken at their feet, silence fell across the camp. But it was not the silence of despair. It was the silence of victory. Liara stood in the rain, her chest heaving, her weapon dripping with water and blood. She looked at Cain, his body scarred, his face bruised, but his eyes burning brighter than ever. The captives gathered around them, waiting, watching, and Liara knew the truth. They were no longer captives. They were free. The uprising had begun, and it would not end here. The camp was silent after the storm of battle. The walls that once held despair now stood broken, their gates shattered, their towers fallen. The air smelled of smoke and blood, but it also carried something new: freedom. Liara stood among the freed captives, her chest heaving, her hands trembling as she dropped the weapon. Her body was bruised, her clothes torn, but her spirit burned like fire. She looked around and saw faces that were no longer hollow. Eyes that once stared at the ground now shone with light. The chains lay scattered across the yard, twisted and broken. They were no longer symbols of power, only relics of a nightmare that had ended. At the center of it all stood Cain, the human. His body was scarred, his wounds fresh, but he stood taller than ever. The captives gathered around him, their voices rising, not in fear, but in gratitude. To them, he was no longer just a stranger. He was the spark that had lit their uprising. He was the warrior who proved chains could not bind the will. Liara stepped closer, her voice soft. "You gave us freedom." Cain shook his head, his eyes steady. "No, you took it yourselves." The words struck her heart because she knew he was right. It was not only his fire, but their courage, their choice, their refusal to stay broken. The night stretched on, and the freed captives gathered around the remains of the camp. Some cried, some laughed, some simply sat in silence. For many, it was the first time in years they had breathed without fear. Liara watched them, and a strange warmth filled her chest. Her people had betrayed her, but here she had found something stronger than blood. She had found family among strangers, bound not by heritage but by survival. The stars glittered above, and for the first time, Liara looked at them without despair. They were no longer unreachable lights, but promises, worlds waiting beyond these broken walls. She turned to Cain, her voice steady. "What happens now?" He looked at the horizon, where the sky began to pale with dawn. "Now we walk free." The words carried weight, not just for her, but for everyone. The captives rose, gathering what little they could. They were scarred, they were weary, but they were no longer slaves. Every step they took beyond the camp was a victory. Every breath of free air was defiance against the chains that once bound them. As they left, Liara walked beside Cain. She glanced at him, her voice trembling. "My people betrayed me, and I thought I was alone." Cain met her gaze, his tone calm. "You are not alone anymore." Her throat tightened, tears burning her eyes. Not of sorrow, but of release. Behind them, the camp smoldered, collapsing into ruin. Ahead of them stretched an uncertain future, but it was theirs to claim. The human had given them a path, but it was up to them to walk it. And they would together. The chains had tried to define them. Betrayal had tried to break them. But now they carried something stronger. They carried freedom. They carried fire. They carried hope. And as the dawn rose over the horizon, Liara knew one truth with certainty. Her people may have sold her, but a human warrior had given her life back. And with him, she would never be powerless again. They walked beyond the chains, into a future no master could control.